A true story about a diary written by a 9-year-old girl as she traveled around the world in 1987. We may have a slight notion what the future may have in store for us, but generally we have no idea. So when we set out on a trip around the world on the 9th of February 1987, little did I know that many years later I would find myself setting the old video footage to the diary that my little daughter Celine wrote at the time. I carried a big, clumsy video camera, filming every day of our entire trip, and at the end I had many hours of video footage that has since been lying dormant for so many years. Yet, I always had a premonition that one day I would know what to do with the old video. When my daughter got married several years ago, I gave her the diary, and since it dawned upon me that I should try and make her little old diary come alive by marrying it with the old video footage and get my little granddaughter Aaliyah to narrate the story. So I now give the word to Celine, who will introduce you to our trip around the world in 60 days.
I was 9 when my father decided to prove to my brother and I that the world was round. So, our school having very generously agreed to release us, we set off on a journey. Departing London on the 9th of February 1987, travelling west, and returning to London from the east on the 7th of April the same year. Before departing, my father produced a small pretty notebook and suggested I keep a diary of our travels. Here are my daily observations, written 34 years ago, about those 60 days.
Our trip round the world. Here we are in Gatwick Airport, and we're just about to board the plane. And we left for New York 11:55 a.m. It was a very pleasant flight, for we had fish and chicken for lunch, and after we watched a film called Tough Guys. We arrived in New York. It is freezing cold, and we are going for a walk along Broadway and to the Rockefeller Center. In there is an ice skating rink, and we saw people ice skating. My cousin, who lives in New York, came to visit us in our hotel, and we went to eat at the top of a skyscraper. The restaurant turned around so you could see the whole of New York. We left New York 10:55 for LA. It was a very nice flight and very comfortable. We landed in LA 1:30 p.m. local time, and we were picked up by the hotel minibus, and it was quite hot. On the plane, we watched a film called Peggy Sue about a girl who goes back to the future. Los Angeles, Disneyland. The next day, we drove to Disneyland, which was 30 miles away, and it took 1 hour to get there. We had plenty of fun, and we went on nearly all the rides. We were there all day. The best ride was the Thunderbolt Railway, which was absolutely great fun. We went in a tunnel at full speed and under steam and water. It sloped sideways and everybody was screaming.
Thank you.
Hollywood. The next day we got up and drove to Hollywood Boulevard to see the footprints of famous actors. Then we went to see a museum which the richest man in the world made, and everything was made of marble and gold. J. Paul Getty was his name. There were many beautiful pictures and sculptures, and they were not fake, they were real, some as old as 2,000 years. LA and Tahiti. Today we went to the beach because we had all the time in the world, because our flight to Tahiti was at 11:40 p.m. at night. On the beach we met some children from Iran and we built a house made of stones. Then we drove to the airport. Because we were too early, I slept in the airport, and then we boarded the plane, and I slept the whole flight through. Tahiti. We landed in Tahiti 5:30 a.m. in the morning. In that country, they didn't kiss for a welcome. They had flower necklaces, and that was their way of saying welcome to Tahiti. We took a truck to Papete, and then sailed to Maria, and then we took a truck to our hotel in Cook's Bay. It was called that because Captain Cook landed in the very same bay from Australia. For the rest of the day we swam. The next day, we rented a car and drove right round Maria. Because it was a small island, we stopped by a beach and saw some crabs. They had been eating snails and then hid in the shells. The drive round the island took till lunchtime, and before we delivered the car, we went to a museum of arts and shells. Snorkeling. The next day, we went swimming in the sea, just outside the shore, and snorkeling over the coral. And there were many beautiful fish. Then we went snorkeling in the deep ocean. We saw some bluefish and some flat yellowfish. After the snorkeling, we went back. At night, we went in the restaurant to eat and see the fire dancing, which was wonderful. The next day, we went to an aquarium to see lots of different fish, and we swam the rest of the day. At the aquarium, there were shells and big shells that had light bulbs put into them, and also rings and necklaces with black pearls in them. We swam all day. At 4:45, we boarded Cake Tree, which is a motorboat, and we went to Tahiti. We stayed in another Ibis hotel. We woke up at 5 and took off 7 from Tahiti to Auckland, New Zealand. Flying time, 5 hours and 4 minutes. We fly over the dateline, so when we arrive in New Zealand, it will be tomorrow. The next day, we were in New Zealand. We swam in the pool at the hotel and tried to find a car. We ended up renting a minibus. When we got to the van, we drove to Rotorua. The trip to Rotorua took 4 hours, and on the way we found a dead opossum. When we got to Rotorua, we found a hotel called Golden Glow. In your room, you had a private spa pool with bubbles in it, which is very healthy for your body. We got up early and drove to the thermal area, which means the ground is bubbling hot, and we saw mud pools, and they were very frightening. Then we went to see a geyser, which is a rock which explodes with hot water. The geyser we went to see only explodes if you put soap in it. 10:15 every day, lots of people came to see the geyser explode. A man came down and told us all about the geysers and how they knew it exploded with soap. Well, 100 years ago, some slaves were looking for hot water. Then the geyser was a pool, so the slave washed their clothes with soap, and 2 seconds later it exploded, and the slave's clothes went 20 meters up in the air. 100 years later, Lady Knox came to wash her clothes in the pool, and the same happened, and that is why they call it the Lady Knox geyser. The man came down, called Oliver and me and 2 other boys to put the soap in. So we did, and the smell was absolutely horrible. Then we went to another thermal area, and there was also a geyser, but that was extinct. But before, it had killed 4 people because this one went 500 meters high. After that, we went on a lake where it had once been a crater, but a volcano erupted right next to it and destroyed and made it into a lake.
Celine, it's probably a giant's cauldron. That is the hole of a volcano. And we're standing at the top of the volcano. There's a duck down there.
The next day, we drove back to Gateway Hotel. When we got there, we took a bus to Central Oakland and walked round, and we went to a gallery. We were in Central Oakland for 4 hours, and we caught the bus home. We flew to Sydney, Australia, and walked around and went to the Sydney Tower, and we saw the Opera House, which was designed by a Danish man. And we walked through Hyde Park, and we went on an underground train. But Australian trains have seats in the middle, top and bottom. Flying to Cairns. It was a very nice flight to Cairns because we had a lovely meal and the people gave us some puzzles, and then they let us go to see the pilot in the cockpit, and he let us ask questions about the plane. When we were in there, the pilot had it on automatic, so it was going by itself. The next day we sailed on a boat with a jet engine. It was very, very fast. We sailed to Green Island and we went to a museum there. There were live animals and we saw turtles, baby sharks and crocodiles. Then we swam in the clear sea. The next day we went with Bob and his 2 boys, Nathan and Brent, and their mum to the Crystal Cascades up in the rainforests, in the big rivers and waterfalls. We went swimming and all you had to do was sit at the top of the waterfall and slide down. Then we went to a river where there was not a waterfall, and we went diving and snorkeling, and we had floats to float on and play on. When we went back, we went home with Nathan and Brent and watched cartoons and played. The boys played cricket while I played with a little girl called Amy. And for dinner we had a Chinese takeaway. Then we took a jet engine boat to Fitzroy. But the boat broke down and we were an hour delayed. But we got there in the end. On Fitzroy there was a swimming pool, and in the middle of the pool there was an island, and in one end was a spa pool. There were no sandy beaches, but there was one beach, but it only had a little bit of sand. When we got there, we bought masks and snorkels. Oliver got a blue mask and blue snorkel, and I got a yellow mask and yellow snorkel. Then we had a 25-minute walk through a rainforest to a beach where we went snorkeling and swimming. After that, we went back to the pool, and I met a girl called Lena, and her dad was the driver of a jet engine boat. Then it was time to go home, and when we got back, we were very tired. The next day, we flew to Alice Springs, but first we stopped over at Mount Issa, an old mining town. Then we took off and flew to Alice Springs. When we got there, we rented a car so we could drive to Aaliyah, Ayers Rock. The next day, we got up early and climbed right to the top and wrote our names in the logbook. And then we took Oliver to the doctor and catched up in my diary.
Okay, that's it.
The next morning, we got up 5:30 a.m. and set off 6 a.m. to drive back to Alice Springs, and that was a 300 miles. When we got there, we waited 1 hour for our plane. 11:10 a.m. we boarded a plane for Sydney. When we arrived in Sydney, it was raining. It was 3:10 p.m. So we took a bus to Manhattan Hotel. The next morning, we set off to find a car. We got a good deal with Thrifty. With the car, we drove to Sydney Opera House, which was designed by a Danish architect. Then we went to McDonald's. Tomorrow, we start driving to Adelaide. At the Opera House, we had a guided tour, and it was very beautiful. We left this morning for Featherdale Wildlife Park. At the wildlife park, we saw koalas, opossums, kangaroos, wombats, dingoes, and tropical parrots. Then, when the man came to change the gum leaves, a koala hid, and then the man took the gum leaves out, and the koala fell out too. After that, we carried on driving to Adelaide. We drove through the Blue Mountains. Then, we found a little town called Crow, and there we found a nice motel and had some chicken. That night it started to storm. This morning we left 9 a.m. and headed south for Albury by the Murray River. When we got to Albury, we found a nice riverside motel. There was a big lawn to play on, and it was hot. Then we went on a canoe on the river, and the current was very strong. It was Sunday, and we headed for Adelaide. 10:20 a.m. And then, when we had driven a couple of hours, we stopped at a playground and had something to eat. Then we drove to a town where we found a motel. At that town, there was a fishing competition, and we also went to see some opals. At night, we had a lovely meal at a bistro. We got underway 9 a.m. today, and we were almost in Adelaide. When we had stopped for lunch, we decided to drive into a wine valley called Barossa Valley, and there were lots and lots of vineyards. We went to the wine tasting place, and the smell was awful. Then we found a hotel and stayed the night there. The next morning, we got up early to go and reached Adelaide at 10:30 a.m. It is a very beautiful city and very clean too. Then we went for a walk round the Opera House and in the park near the River Torners. Today we will catch a train to Perth at 6 p.m. Before, we walked around the town and bought t-shirts. On Oliver's t-shirt was a kangaroo with Adelaide on it, and speed limit 320. On my t-shirt there was Australia with koalas. On it said koala country. Then we had lunch in the park. Then it was time to deliver the car and drop me, Oliver and Mum off at the station, only to find it was the wrong station. Then we took a taxi to the right station and the train to Perth. Oliver and me had our very own cabin, and it looked out of the window to see blue shrubs and red desert. We stopped at a small station called Cook. We got off for half an hour. We did not like it for all the flies. There was a straight railway track, 478 kilometres. Absolutely amazing. We arrived in Perth 7 a.m. and while we waited for the rental car, we had breakfast at a station. When we got the car, this time it was not new but old. Then we found a responsible hotel and looked for a GP for our vaccinations against hepatitis before to leave on Friday. In the afternoon, we drove to Fremantle and there was a nice market. Today we drove through Swan Valley, but disappointed in what we saw compared to Barossa Valley near Adelaide. Then we went to the beach for a swim. In the afternoon, we walked through a city of Perth, and at night we had a Hungry Jack. Today we sailed 2 hours to an island called Rottnest. The reason they call it that is the first person to find the island came from Holland and saw wombats and thought they were big rats. So rot means rat in Holland, so they called it Rottnest. Then we played on the beach and laid in the sun all day. We started to drive down to the coast 9:30 a.m. to Augusta and got there at 3 p.m. Just before we got there, we stopped at a dam. The river was called Serpentine. When we got to Augusta, we went to a beach with rocks on it and we climbed on the rocks, and there were big waves that splashed us. Today I was not feeling well and sleeping most of the time, and we drove for 108 kilometres in forest with the tallest trees you have ever seen. In the afternoon we came to Lake Dumpleyung, where Sir Donald Campbell set the world water speed record in 1961. Later we passed Lake Grace, a huge salt lake, and the salt was so thick we walked on it. And later we stopped in a villa called Cullen overnight. We woke up early and set off for Wave Rock. We got to Wave Rock after 9. It was funny, for it looked like a wave.
Daddy, and it's good it takes the sound, isn't it?
Beside the rock there was a dam which took water from the rock. At the rock there was Aboriginal arts.
What came from the rock over there? Rock there. Look, there's Aborigines prints.
After that we drove to York and had an ice cream. At York there were old cars. Then we stopped overnight at Tudgay. We stayed in a motel and there was a swing and budgies and cockatoo and wallabies in cages. Later, we drove to Perth and we went on the beach and had a swim. Then we went to a playground and went to a magic apple to eat, and I got new shoes. Today we fly to Bali, island of paradise. On the plane, we saw a film. It was Top Gun. When we arrived in Bali, we waited a big time for our luggage. When we got to the hotel, Winter Cottages, there was a big pool. The pool was very, very deep, but there was a small pool for children and a slide. There were monkeys in cages, and it was very hot. The next day, we rented a jeep and drove up North Island on a very lonely road. Because all the children hardly see white children, they wave and say hello. We had lunch in Kintamani and got a good deal with local people. Whopping necklace for half the price. We drove onto Lavina Beach and stayed in a cottage made of bamboo right next to the water. We got up early this morning to go snorkeling in the sea. It was very nice and we sailed in a very nice boat. Then we drove and had a drink. And while we drank, a young man came in with a fresh fish and we asked if we could have the fish. And it was a very nice lunch. Later on the beach, we bought presents for Christine, Hayley and Mummy and met 2 young people on the beach.
I got 6. No, it's just a camel. Is it not?
After, Daddy told off the man and we drove from Lavina Beach to Bedigal, a small town with a lake called Broughton.
You can walk down to the river from there.
On the drive, we went through a monkey forest and saw flocks of monkeys on the road.
Whoa. Oh no! Oh no!
Then we found a lovely hotel, Lita Clara. In the room, the loo was outside in the bathroom, so when we went to the loo, you could look at flowers and grass and insects. Then we went to a place beside the lake where they let people parasail and water ski, and we watched them take off and land, and it was great fun. Then it rained and rained and rained, and we stayed indoors to catch up on homework. We had breakfast and decided to go and see the temple. On the way, we met a man and he said he would take us on a trip round the lake. First to the temple, then to the other side of the jungle and saw some monkeys. Then we went to some caves dug by Charis Soleger under the Second World War. It was a very nice trip. After that, we went to the monkey forest and aimed the monkeys. That was fun. Today we took one of the waiters to see the boss because Daddy wanted to buy Lita Clara. The boss said that we should see the marketing manager tomorrow. We continued to drive along the coast and came to Candidasi Beach and found a hotel right by the beach. We swam and played in the sand. In the evening, we walked across the road to see Balinese dancing, which lasted 2 hours. Today we drive to Kuta, but decided to leave 1 o'clock as Daddy didn't have to see the man till 4. So Oliver and me had a great time swimming, playing and jumping in the water. Later we drove back to Kuta and Daddy met the man and Oliver and me had a drink. We arrived in Singapore 10:06 p.m. and came to our hotel, Grand Central. Today we took a bus to Chinatown and bought some hats. I got a Chinese one and Daddy got a jungle hat. Then we took a taxi down to the water, but instead we got a boring traffic light trip. Later we went on a boring sitting down trip. Very, very boring. Today we fly to Bangkok, but first we had time to go see Raffles Hotel, a beautiful paradise in the middle of a stinking city. Then we took a taxi back and Oliver and me swam in the pool and I got a horrible cold sore. We arrived in Bangkok 8 p.m. and went to Manora Hotel and skipped a meal as we had 2 on the flight. Today we met a guide who will take us on a tour round some temples. There was a Buddha made of solid gold. The story is said that the man who had the golden Buddha covered it in cement and wanted it to come to the temple it was in now. On the way there was a storm and the cement cracked and inside there was a solid gold Buddha. In the other temple there was a Buddha lying down. He was dying. He was covered in gold and he was very long. Today we go to India, but first we go down to the Oriental and look at the pool. Then we hired a boat and sailed around the river and to the floating market in Bangkok. Then we went back and rested. After we had some dinner and went for a walk, then our friend, Mr. Lecky, drove us to the airport. Our plane left at midnight. Then we arrived in India, 2 o'clock in the morning. Then we got a taxi and we got a very rough driver. We arrived at our hotel, which was Oberoi Maidens, and got to bed at 5 o'clock. Today we woke up late as we had a late night and had breakfast and lunch at noon. Then hired a 3-wheeled scooter taxi and drove to the Red Fort. After, we went on a taxi drive round Delhi. We came back to the hotel and swam in the pool and had a great time. Today we got up early and got a chauffeur-driven car to Agra and Taj Mahal. That trip took 4 hours. Then we got a guide around. First, we saw marble carvings.
India in the Mughal period, when the Persian artisans were brought to work on the Taj Mahal. From then, it is coming down from father to son, one family workmanship. They all rely on marble that is used on the Taj Mahal. It is all done by the feeling of the fingers and the eyes that work, and there is no measuring instrument as such for them.
Recut in 1948. Now it is 865.
Then we went to a jewellery shop and I held the biggest topaz in the world. Then we went to look at carpets and we bought some, one made of silk and one made of wool.
She doesn't understand how expensive she is holding.
Today we leave for Jaipur, but first we stopped at a place called Faidpur Sikri. The trip took 5 hours. On the way we saw bears dancing on the road. We arrived in Jaipur 3 o'clock. We found a hotel called Mangal Hotel. It was terrible, I should say. It was just above garbage trash, but it was the best we could find. Today we got up early to see some sightseeing. First, we went to see Albert Hall, a museum. Then we passed Hawaiian Mahal, a very beautiful building. It was a city hall. Then we went to a modern observatory. There were lots of monkeys, some with babies. Then we went to Amber Fort and Palace, which was built on top of a hill. We walked up to the palace courtyard and saw all the beautiful buildings and the Hall of Mirrors and the view, and a man took a photo of Oliver and me. Then we bought a necklace made of moonstone and a ring for Mummy. Then we rode an elephant. That was great fun. Then we started our long drive back to Delhi. We arrived in Delhi only to find there was no room at Oberoi Maidan, so we checked in at another hotel, which was not very nice. Then, that morning, we went back to Oberoi Maidans, where they had promised a room for us. That day, Oliver was not very well and had a temperature. Then I relaxed by the pool and swam with Mummy and Daddy all day, and Oliver rested in the cool room. Today is our last day in India and our world trip. As this evening we are flying back to England. I'm looking forward to going back very much, as it is Easter holidays. We are spending the day by the pool, preparing for the flight back home.